Hi, I just beat Sea of Stars and I'm here to talk about it. As a warning, this video will contain minor spoilers. I won't be talking about the story directly, but the footage I use will show playable characters, combat systems, enemy types, and various other things that may not appear until later in the game. Sea of Stars is a retro-inspired turn-based RPG that follows two protagonists, Zale and Valir, who are born with special powers related to the sun and the moon, respectively. They are taken to Zenith Academy at a young age where they train to become Solstice Warriors. Solstice Warriors are like the superheroes of this universe, and their job is to take down powerful evil creatures known as Dwellers, who function as the main bosses of the game. Zale and Valir set out on a journey with their non-power-having friend Garl to fully unlock their Solstice powers and defeat the Dwellers who threaten the safety of the world. I tend to be drawn toward pixel art, so Sea of Stars' retro-inspired aesthetic immediately captivated me. It does a good job of mimicking the vibe of classic low-res Super Nintendo RPGs while also introducing its own stylish flair to push the game world into a more modern direction. Each zone feels like a perfect blend of classic and modern visual techniques, like a smooth fusion of two different time periods. The game's clever usage of light and shadow helps add some extra dimension to every biome, as well as lots of cool, shimmery, glowy stuff. I don't really have anything else to say about the game's visuals other than they're pretty. And the soundtrack slaps. Sometimes when I entered a new zone, I found myself saying, "This is a bop," and then realized I did that for every single song in the game. Combat is usually my favorite part of JRPGs, so I was very excited to see what Sea of Stars brought to the table in this area. At its core, it follows the traditional turn-based combat formula, but there are some things that set it apart from the standard fare. While enemies in this game have a turn priority order, your party does not, meaning you can freely choose which party member acts first. Not only that, but once you gather more than 3 party members, you can freely swap in your reserve party without using a turn. This adds a bit more flexibility to normally rigid JRPG combat, as you're able to pull from the strengths of your entire roster whenever you want, and choose which party member to use based on the situation. I also enjoyed this from an immersion perspective because it makes you feel like everyone is fighting in battle together, even if they aren't currently on the battlefield. Since turn-based combat can be monotonous at times, some JRPGs will spice things up by adding interactive button presses to give the player more input during battle. I think Super Mario RPG is the most famous example of this concept, but the mechanic also exists in a variety of other JRPGs like Legend of Dragoon, Lost Odyssey, and Shadow Hearts. Sea of Stars takes a page from this book by allowing the player to power up their attacks with precisely timed button presses. This also introduces a non-standard way of guarding enemy attacks. As there is no guard option in battle, the player needs to use button timing to reduce damage, meaning that you have to pay attention to how each enemy behaves and move so that you can block their attacks correctly. This type of system is very polarizing among RPG fans, but I personally love it for its extra layer of challenge. The game doesn't tell you the timing for every single attack, so it's up to the player to discover it themselves. Some are obvious, like basic attacks, where all you do is hit the button on impact to chain into a second hit. Then there's Zale's Sunball, which just prompts you to hold the button to build power, but instead of holding it the full duration, there's a half second before the end of the animation where the Sunball glows its brightest, and if you let go here, you actually get max power. The healing abilities have pretty weird timing, like Garl's Nourish, which I didn't even know you could power up until I absentmindedly mashed A and he tossed out a sandwich instead of an apple. The cool thing about this system is that it's not required to hit every timing to perform well in combat. Just being able to time some basic attacks and a guard every now and then is enough to succeed, but it's exciting and rewarding every time you are actually able to pull off some of the more advanced timings. I found myself using Valir's Moonerang ability more than any other skill in the game just because I couldn't resist playing the minigame of bouncing it back and forth to try to beat my previous high score. I wonder if we can end it with this Moonerang. Ready? Good luck. With the power of the moon, I will punish you! The biggest twist on Sea of Stars combat, though, is the lock system. Anytime an enemy wants to use a skill, a chain of locks will appear on their head. To interrupt the skill, you have to break all the locks before they take their turn by hitting them with the specific damage types shown. These locks can be broken in any order, and the chains can vary in length and complexity based on the enemy. Due to the random nature of the locks, sometimes you can get unlucky chains that are impossible for you to break in your current circumstance, so you're not really meant to interrupt every ability. But some enemy skills will weaken with every lock broken, so even if you can't interrupt it entirely, you can at least dampen it a bit. In tandem with the free party swapping system I discussed earlier, this lock system does a very important thing for the game's combat. It encourages you to use a variety of abilities from every party member. Something I tend to dislike in turn-based RPGs is when you have a plethora of skills to choose from, but you just end up using the same skill over and over again because it's the highest damage and there's not really a good reason to use the others. Sea of Stars answers this problem by designing its combat with diversity in mind. Each party member is assigned a unique element, so you're gonna have to use different party members' skills to deal with different types of lock chains. You can also enchant normal weapon attacks with the element of your character and perform powerful combo attacks that utilize multiple characters' elements to help whittle down the more complex chains. There were quite a few times throughout my playthrough where I would see this really long chain pop up over a boss and I'd be like, there's absolutely no way I can do this, but then through some clever combinations of party swapping, weapon enchanting, combos, and ability selecting, I'd manage to surprise myself and barely interrupt the spell. And I think this is where the lock system really shines. It allows for these really clutch moments where you beautifully weave together a string of different actions to stop a boss from melting you. Something important to note is that the characters in this game do not have large mana pools, and skills are very mana hungry, so you really have to manage your resources properly. Spamming skills without thought will end up in a lot of unbroken lock chains, which can make fights go south pretty fast. There's also some important strategy involved in deciding when you have to just give up on a lock chain and let the enemy's skill go through, while trying your best to mitigate its impact. Overall, I really liked the way the lock system impacted the flow of combat. It encourages you to think with foresight, where you ask yourself, if a lock chain shows up next turn, will I be able to deal with it? Should I save mana? Should I save this party member's attack for next turn? This was Sea of Stars' unique take on the retro turn-based formula, and I think they did a good job of spicing it up. It's especially important for turn-based games to have interesting battle animations, because if you spend a lot of the game watching your characters automatically do stuff, they better look heckin' cool while they do it. That being said, the skills in Sea of Stars are all pretty fun to watch, with each character having their own unique way of fighting, as well as color-coded abilities. There are some fun interactions between the characters for their combo attacks, and their ultimate abilities are all anime intro levels of badassery. Healing items in this game come in the form of food, which you can cook yourself using ingredients you gather around the game world. You start with a few basic recipes and find more as you progress throughout the game. I think the typical JRPG gamer is used to hoarding all of their consumables and saving them for the right moment, but the interesting thing about this system is that you can only hold 10 food items at any given time, so you're actively encouraged to use your healing items in battle to make room for newer ones. In addition to cooking with ingredients you find as you adventure, you can also cook with fish you get from fishing! That's right, there's a fishing minigame. Devs know by now that gamers dig fishing minigames, so it was smart of Sea of Stars to include this. The equipment system is very simple. Weapon and armor are always flat stat increases, so there's never really a reason to use an older piece of equipment. Accessories can have some more interesting effects that affect things like mana gain, the impact of perfect timing, or combo point generation. None of it is super exciting, but this is a pretty standard JRPG equipment system, so I can't really complain. There is an interesting piece of gear not tied to any individual character called a relic. Relics are basically settings that you can toggle on or off, and they adjust the rules of the game. You start with a relic that makes the game easier by giving your party plus 100% HP, for example, if you prefer a simpler combat experience. There's one that makes shops cheaper, fishing easier, and various other combat aids. Essentially, relics are the game's version of altering difficulty levels in a more modular way. I thought the relics were a neat concept, but found it a bit weird that you had to purchase them at shops to effectively buy an easier difficulty rather than just including them from the start. I didn't use any of the easy mode stuff, and I found the game's difficulty to be alright, but as someone who prefers a challenge, it did feel a little on the easier side once you master the lock chain system. There's one optional fight I died on like 6 times in a row, but most of the story bosses were pretty simple. Simple isn't always a bad thing though, and I never had to stop to grind experience, which is a huge plus because that meant there were less breaks in the flow of the game. Based on the difficulty of combat, I think the devs wanted to provide an experience that could be enjoyable not just for JRPG vets, but also for people new to the genre, which is a great target to shoot for, and I think they succeeded with it. The monster design in the game was perfect, with a good selection of cute, weird, funny, and creepy enemies. Some standouts for me were the chaotic Golgol, a dancing zombie who performs random actions, including attacking his own teammates and vanishing out of existence. The Sling Rabbit, a rabbit who sticks its flaming butt up in the air to enhance its attacks, and the legendary Boulder Douche, who speaks for himself. One of the biggest highlights for me in this game was the fluidity of movement outside of combat. JRPG movement, especially in older JRPGs, tends to feel very stiff and rarely has any form of mobility other than just walking around. Or if there is ever any fancy mobility, it's usually performed via a cutscene, and your character has to stop to perform it. Sea of Stars, on the other hand, has seamless jumping to add a vertical element to game traversal, and moving around feels like you're playing a platformer. There are geysers that launch you up into the air, a grappling hook that lets you quickly launch yourself from platform to platform, and you can swim almost anywhere there's water. The movement feels very slick and free, and this is another example of the developers finding these ways to modernize the classic genre. One thing I didn't like about traversing the game world is that while you do eventually get ways to travel around the overworld quickly, once you're in a zone, there's no method to quickly return to the world map, so you constantly have to run back through the same areas to leave the zone. This gets especially noticeable later in the game when you have to revisit certain areas to collect items or do side quests, and there's no quick escape method. The game has a fair amount of puzzles, and I think they nailed the difficulty on them. They don't feel too hard, but they are challenging enough to make you feel accomplished when you solve them. They're uniquely tailored to blend into each zone you find them in, so they feel connected to the flow of the game and not out of place, like rolling around these giant eyeballs inside of this creepy castle. There's also quite a bit of variety, and the game has some fresh takes on the puzzle meta with a mechanic that allows you to activate lunar and solar switches by changing the time of day at will. It changes the lighting of the zone you're in accordingly, which looks visually amazing. Unfortunately, this day-night mechanic is only ever used to activate switches, which I think is a missed opportunity. I would have liked to have seen more done with this system, like maybe having monsters behave differently depending on whether it's day or night, or rare spawns depending on the time of day, or certain abilities maybe being empowered. There is a slot machine game called Wheels, which is a nod to other classic JRPG minigames like Triple Triad from FF8. It looks very confusing at first glance, but once you learn it, it's surprisingly simple and incredibly fun. Each town has a Wheels champion that you can challenge, and as you beat each one, you get access to different pieces to use in your matches. I enjoyed this minigame so much that I ended up seeking out every champion to get 100% Wheels completion, and I do not regret it. 10 out of 10 minigame, I am now addicted to slots. Rainbow conches are the main collectible of Sea of Stars, and they make up the bulk of the game's side content. These rainbow fucks are hidden throughout the game world in chests, but you also receive them as rewards for doing certain side quests. You can trade them into an NPC for various helpful items, like this awful parrot that tells you where more rainbow conches are. So I'm not usually a big side quest guy, but there are only 60 rainbow conches, and the game world is small enough that I found collecting them to be pretty manageable and satisfying. I won't be talking about the game story in detail, but I do want to give some of my overarching thoughts about it. There are some really awesome twists that had me shitting and pissing, but there was also some questionable writing that I wasn't a huge fan of. I found Zale and Valir to be kind of dull. they're pretty one-dimensional as protagonists. The party members they meet along their journey, however, end up being much more memorable and interesting. My favorite character in the game was definitely Sarai, and I can't really talk about her without spoiling things, unfortunately, but she was just so fucking cool. There's another big problem I had with this story though, and I'll explain it with an example. At the very beginning of the game, Zale and Valir are introduced to the concept of sewing, which is made out to be this really important thing. They each imbue a piece of fabric with magical energy by slowly sewing it together over the period of several years, and the fabric is meant to help boost their solstice powers. I thought this sewing concept was really cool, and I was excited to see where the game was going to go with it. Like maybe they'd sew their own gear throughout the game, or collect different fabrics that had different effects. But once the prologue ends, they just stick the fabrics onto their waists, they become part of the character design, and sewing is never once mentioned again. There are various times like this throughout the game where new concepts and sometimes even new characters are introduced and seem like they have a lot of narrative potential, but then they're never explored further or mentioned again. Every time an interesting character or creature or idea appeared, it always felt like it was gone too quickly and the game would just scoot past it. I guess I wish they had maybe fewer concepts that were expanded upon more, rather than too many concepts that they couldn't fully realize. The game's universe and lore was much more grand in scope than what you actually get to play. This can be seen in the game's camping system, where you can collect books to have an NPC read you backstories about different characters you encounter in the game. It's nice that this fills in some gaps, but I would rather this information be worked into the actual gameplay. I think that the big JRPG classics, things like Chrono Trigger or Earthbound, are known for being these grand epic tales. And when you finally reach the end of them, it feels emotional because of how much your party has been through for the entire game. But I didn't really get this feeling from Sea of Stars. It felt like it wanted to be that. It felt like it wanted to get there. It wanted to have that powerful crescendo at the end of the game where you're just left in awe, but it just didn't quite make it for me, which is unfortunate because there's so much about the game that I loved. Story criticisms aside, at the end of the day, I still had a really good time playing this game, bouncing those 20-hit moonerangs, breaking lock chains, getting addicted to wheels, and exploring the game's beautifully crafted world. Sea of Stars does a great job of finding clever ways to improve on the retro JRPG formula while still staying true to the classics it's inspired from. It is a charming love letter to an older gaming era, and the developer's passion for the genre clearly shines through in this project. I'm not really a number scale reviewer kind of guy, but I will say that overall, Sea of Stars is definitely Pasta Ghost approved. Thank you to Sabotage Studios for all of their hard work in creating this game, and thank you guys for watching. See you next time.